I was filed under alternate, non-lineage, Slot 7, and nobody at the Kelvrath compound expected Slot 7 to ever be called. It existed because Combine regulation required it, the way a fire door exists in a building nobody plans to burn. A legacy cadet from the Dorenvane line had washed out of pre-selection with a torn shoulder tendon 2 days before intake, and some clerk 3 offices down the chain filled the gap with the first name on a waiting registry instead of leaving it empty. That name was mine. I'd put it there 11 months earlier on a colony relief work exchange form, thinking it meant a maintenance contract on an orbital breaker yard, not a seat in the Osvane Combine's officer selection program. I found out what I'd actually signed when a transport dropped me on a moon annex with gravity plating a fifth again too strong for my legs, and a compound the size of a small city built entirely around bloodline. Before that morning, the largest institution I'd ever answered to was a scrapping crew of 11 people, and a foreman who paid us by the ton. I grew up on a breaker yard 3 moons out from anywhere anyone official cared about, cutting derelict hull sections down to salvage weight with my mother and an uncle who'd lost 2 fingers to a plasma seam before I was old enough to remember his hand whole. Nobody there had ever asked where my family came from. They'd asked whether I could read a stress fracture before it opened, and whether I could hold a torch steady for 6 hours without my hand shaking, and that had been the whole of the application process. The Osvane don't hide what they value. Every cadet who wasn't me wore a narrow strip of skin at the throat that lit up in slow, layered color, a lineage crest, inherited, unfakeable, read at a glance by anyone who'd grown up learning the pattern the way I'd grown up learning which hull seams held pressure, and which ones lied to you. Deep saturated color meant deep lineage, generations of officers going back far enough that the color itself had a name in their records. Faint, thin color meant a candidate whose family had only recently earned standing, still climbing. My throat was bare. Not faint, bare. To them, that wasn't a gap in the data. It was an absence of a category entirely, the visual equivalent of a name with no letters in it, and I watched more than one cadet do a double take at my collar in the first hour, the way you'd look twice at a door that should have had a number on it and didn't. Selection Marshal Rennick Ashford met the 4 of us who'd been rerouted in through registry error, 3 Osvane from minor branch families, thin-crested and nervous, and me, in the yard on the first morning, under a sky the color of wet slate, and he looked at my throat for exactly as long as it took him to decide there was nothing there worth reading twice. 4 alternates, he said, to nobody in particular, the crest at his own throat running the deep, unbroken blue-black of a marshal's line, 9 generations confirmed, a color so saturated it looked less like skin than like something poured. History says one of you finishes intake. History has been wrong before. It has never been wrong about the bare-throated ones. He didn't say it unkindly. That was the strange part I only understood later. Ashford wasn't cruel. He was accurate, according to 140 years of the compound's own records. And he told me so without malice, because to him, it was simply what the data said. The same way I'd have told a new hand on the breaker crew that nobody survives their first month without gloves. I filed the sentence away next to a few hundred others like it, and went to find my bunk, which turned out to be a cot at the far end of a barracks row nobody else wanted, closest to the door, coldest air in the room. I slept fine. I'd slept in worse. The first trial was called the Ridge Ascent, 9 kilometers up the eastern grade under moongrav plating carrying a fifth again too much of me, with a sealed pack that got heavier the longer you carried it, by design. Some slow mechanical bleed of ballast weight meant to simulate a supply run under battlefield conditions where nothing ever gets lighter no matter how badly you want it to. The instructors didn't run beside us. They watched from a transport skimming the ridgeline and took notes. 2 of the other alternates broke on the climb, one at the 4-kilometer marker with his knee folded wrong underneath him, one just short of the 7, sitting down in the scree and not getting up again no matter what anyone shouted at him. The 3rd alternate finished, technically, an hour behind the field, and quit that same night anyway, packing his kit in the dark and asking for a transport back down before sunrise, because something about watching 2 men break in front of him had convinced him the math Ashford had quoted was simply correct, and there was no version of the season worth the proving of it. I finished in the back third of the field, legs shaking so hard I had to sit down twice on the last kilometer just to keep my vision from going white at the edges. 4 minutes past my own worst private guess at where my limit sat. Nobody clocked it as anything but survival. Threven Cass finished in the top 3, crest running a proud saturated gold blue against the gray light, and didn't look at me once on the way down, stepping past my spot on the scree like I was part of the terrain. Cass was the kind of cadet the compound had been built to produce. Ninth generation on his mother's side, sixth on his father's, hands that had never once had to fix anything because in his life nothing had ever been allowed to stay broken near him for longer than it took to summon someone whose job it was. He wasn't stupid. That would have made it easier to place him. He was sharp, disciplined, physically capable in a way that cost him nothing to maintain, and completely, structurally incapable of imagining that competence could exist somewhere his own crest reader couldn't confirm it first. "You're bad math," he told me, the second week, in the equipment hall while we waited on kit issue. Not as an insult so much as an observation, the way you'd note that a number didn't reduce cleanly no matter how you worked it. The compound doesn't process bad math, it rounds it off eventually. Save yourself the rounding. I didn't answer that one. Rounding off was a thing that happened to people who stopped showing up, and I'd grown up watching men on the breaker crew get rounded off by employers who decided their hands were too old, or their backs too tired, and I'd learned early that the only real answer to it was continuing to be there the next morning. I kept showing up. I fixed my own bunk hinge the second night when nobody else bothered reporting it broken. I learned 3 of the instructors' names before I learned any of the cadets. I ate alone at the end of the mess hall bench and didn't mind it, because eating alone was a familiar kind of quiet, and the compound had plenty of the unfamiliar kind to spare. The second trial was the one meant, though nobody labeled it this way on the schedule, to separate doctrine from instinct. It was called Systems Contingency, and it ran every remaining candidate through a simulated hull integrity failure on a mocked-up transport section, working strictly from the Combine's own approved fault response manual. 311 pages, memorized cold by every legacy cadet before they could reliably walk, because the manual was as much a lineage artifact in that culture as the crest itself. You didn't just learn it. You inherited the habit of trusting it completely, the way you'd inherit a family's opinion of a neighboring house. The sim ran the standard fault first, a coolant line rupture straight out of page 206. Response memorized, response correct. Candidates through in under 6 minutes each, one after another, clean and confident. Then it ran the second fault, the one that wasn't in the manual at all, because HFY had quietly ordered the simulation crew to layer in a genuine unlisted failure mode nobody at the compound had formally cataloged yet, a harmonic resonance building in a support strut as a direct side effect of the coolant fix itself. Invisible on the standard readout, audible only as a specific wrongness in the hum of the deck plating. The kind of sound you only learn by standing on failing decks long enough to know the difference between a hull settling into itself and a hull working up to letting go. Cass went through the second fault perfectly by the book, and then stood in the sim bay for nearly 4 minutes, running increasingly frantic manual cross-references, while the readout climbed steadily toward a result the manual simply had no page for. 2 other legacy cadets did the same thing in their own turns, flipping through a document that had never once failed them before and refusing, understandably, to believe it could fail them now. The manual told them everything except what was actually happening in the deck beneath their boots, and none of them had ever needed to trust anything but the manual, so none of them thought, even once, to stop trusting it and simply listen. I felt it in my boots before I ever looked at the board. 9 years of standing on hull sections that groaned before they gave had taught me that particular resonance the way some people learn to recognize a voice on a comm channel through static. I didn't check the manual. I found the strut by feel, wedged a support brace against the load-bearing joint using a maintenance clamp meant for a different job entirely, and bled the pressure through a secondary vent the manual's authors had never mentioned, because the manual's authors had never once had to improvise a fix with the wrong tool, in bad light, on a deadline that didn't care whether the correct tool existed. Total time, 2 minutes 11 seconds. The sim board had no category for that either. It flagged the run anomalous, manual deviation, result, stable, and left it exactly there. Because whoever had written the scoring software had assumed deviation from doctrine could only ever mean failure, never a faster road to the same stable outcome by a different door. HFY read the flag standing at the console, and for the first time I watched his crest do something I hadn't seen it do all season. A slow ripple through the blue-black, not brightening, not dimming, just moving, the visual equivalent of a man going quiet mid-sentence and deciding to stay that way a while. "You didn't reference the manual," he said. "Didn't have time to," I said. "Sound was wrong. Fix the sound." He didn't answer that directly. He made a note on a slate I never saw the contents of, folded it shut, and the trial moved on to the next candidate without further comment. Cass didn't speak to me again that week, though I noticed his crest ran a thinner color for 2 days afterward, the kind of pale that in Osvane physiology apparently sat closer to doubt than I'd have guessed a color alone could carry. Word moved through the barracks the way it does in any crew, official channel or not, and by the end of that week, 3 separate junior cadets had found excuses to walk past my bunk and ask, carefully, whether I'd really skip the manual entirely, like they were checking a rumor against the one man who'd know. The final trial was called Command Continuity, and it was designed, on paper, to be the cleanest test in the entire program, a scripted leadership scenario, a mock evacuation of a mock colony section, graded strictly on decisiveness and adherence to chain of command doctrine, under a controlled, entirely fabricated sense of urgency. 6 cadets ran it in sequence that final week, one at a time, each scenario reset and reseated between runs so no candidate could learn from the one before him. I was scheduled last, which on a program built around lineage order meant exactly what it sounds like, and I spent the morning of it standing in the observation corridor outside the gallery, watching the others go in one after another through a reinforced viewing pane, waiting my turn against a wall that hummed faintly under my palm, in a way none of the Osvane cadets standing beside me seemed to notice at all. What none of us knew, because the compound didn't advertise its own maintenance backlog to selection candidates, was that the actual life support relay feeding the observation gallery above the mock colony section, the gallery where 24 junior instructors and the entire selection board sat every trial to watch the scripted drill, had been flagged for replacement 14 months earlier, and never replaced, because replacing it meant shutting the gallery down mid-selection season, and no officer wanted to be the one who delayed the program over routine maintenance. It failed during Cass's run, not the sim. The real relay, 15 meters above the mock colony floor, feeding real air to real people, and it failed exactly the way real equipment fails when nobody's watched it closely enough for 14 months. Quietly, then all at once, the gallery's oxygen mix drifting wrong for 4 full minutes, before anyone up there registered it as anything worse than a headache and a strange tightness behind the eyes. Cass was mid-scenario when the real alarm cut through the scripted one, 2 different tones stacked crooked on top of each other, and I watched him freeze for the length of a full breath through the viewing pane, because his entire 18 years of training had built him flawless, instant responses to every failure mode that had ever been formally cataloged for him, and this one hadn't been cataloged anywhere. The gallery alarm wasn't on his scenario sheet. It took him a full 4 seconds to understand the second alarm was real and not part of the test, and 4 seconds, at altitude in thinning air, is a very long time to spend deciding what's actually happening. I wasn't in the scenario. I was standing in the corridor waiting my turn, which meant I was the one cadet in the entire building not locked into a script telling him exactly what to do next, free to notice that the sound coming down through the gallery vents had gone thin and wrong in a way the drill had never once produced before. The relay junction, once I got the access panel off, was a design I recognized on sight, decades-old orbital life support architecture, the same family of coupling my uncle had rebuilt with 3 remaining fingers more times than either of us had ever bothered to count, because that particular coupling was practically famous among breaker crews for failing exactly this way, slowly, at the seam, under a housing that looked entirely intact right up until the moment it wasn't. I didn't need a schematic for it. I'd had my hands inside its cousin since I was younger than most of the cadets standing frozen in that gallery above me. I went up the maintenance ladder instead of the cadet stairs, because the ladder was faster and because nobody had explicitly told me I wasn't allowed to use it. Cracked the housing with the multi-tool I'd carried in my kit since day one out of old habit rather than any regulation requiring it. Found the seam exactly where I expected it to be, and reseated the coupling by hand while an instructor 2 decks up shouted something about protocol I genuinely didn't have the spare attention to process. The mix stabilized in under 90 seconds. Nobody in that gallery ever found out how close the actual number had been, and I never volunteered it. HFY found me afterward in the maintenance stairwell, still holding the multi-tool, hands black to the wrist with sealant residue, breathing harder than the 90 seconds of work should have earned me. His crest was doing the rippling thing again, longer this time, and he stood there long enough in the stairwell light that I started to wonder whether Osvane physiology even allowed for silence this complete, or whether I was watching something closer to a system genuinely recalculating in real time. There is no category on this compound's boards for a bare-throated alternate who repairs a life support fault. The senior board itself failed to schedule for replacement, he said finally, each word set down like it had been checked twice before being spoken. The board has no record of authorizing you above the maintenance line. You have no record of formal training on that coupling class. Didn't need training, I said. Needed a screwdriver in 9 years. He looked at the multi-tool in my hand like it was the first honest data point the compound had handed him all season, turning it over once with his eyes the way you'd study an instrument you'd been told all your life didn't exist. He didn't smile. Osvane don't, not with a mouth built the way theirs is. But something in the crest settled, slower than I'd seen it settle before, into a color I hadn't watched it produce yet, and never once heard explained to me. Not that season and not after. He didn't reclassify me. The compound never updated the crest reader mounted at the yard gate to register a category for skin carrying no lineage color at all. And as far as I know it still can't, not to this day. What changed instead was smaller, and said nothing out loud where a record could catch it. Cass stopped calling me bad math within the week, started routing his own questions about the older relay systems past the manual, and straight to me instead, standing a little too close while he did it, like proximity might teach him something the crest reader never could. And HFY, on the last morning of the season, stood the graduating cohort in the yard, in strict lineage order same as every season before it, except for one gap near the front where regulation said an alternate slot should stand, which he left conspicuously empty on purpose, and one place at the very end of the line, past every crest in the compound where he put me, and read my name off the same list as everyone else's without pausing on it, without any particular weight in his voice at all. The exact way you'd read off a number that had simply always belonged there and never needed defending. Nobody explained the gap at the front of the line. Nobody explained me at the end of it. The compound's boards, as far as I ever heard afterward, still don't have a field for either one.